Sometimes life breaks us in ways we never expected, leaving us stranded in places we never thought we'd find ourselves. But sometimes, in our darkest moments, help comes from the most unexpected places. Caleb Harlan was a mountain man who'd spent 60 winters alone in the Montana wilderness. Then he found her, a woman in a torn wedding dress, half frozen in the snow. "If you can carry me home, I'll be your wife," she whispered. He didn't know her story, but he wrapped her in his coat and carried her to safety. What started as a desperate bargain would become something neither of them saw coming. But would two broken souls really find healing in each other's company? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin stood like a weathered sentinel against the Montana sky, its log walls darkened by decades of mountain storms. Smoke curled steadily from the stone chimney, the only sign of life in the vast white expanse that stretched toward the Bitterroot Mountains. Inside, the warmth hit like an embrace after the brutal cold outside. Caleb Harlan moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd learned to waste neither motion nor energy. At 60, his frame still carried the solid strength of youth, though silver now threaded his dark hair and lined his weathered face. His hands, scarred from years of trapping and hunting, held a gentleness as he adjusted the blanket around the woman he'd carried from the snow. She'd been unconscious when he found her, her lips blue with cold, that torn wedding dress clinging to her like a tattered dream. Now, 3 days later, she drifted in and out of fever-touched sleep, while he tended her with the same patience he'd learned from nursing injured animals back to health. The cabin reflected 30 years of solitary life. Everything had its place, rifles cleaned and oiled in their rack, traps hanging in neat rows, shelves lined with preserved food and medical supplies. But it was the details that spoke of the man's character: books stacked carefully beside his chair, a hand-carved chess set positioned for play against an imaginary opponent, and a small wooden box on the mantel that he never opened but often touched in passing. He'd built this place with his own hands after Martha died. The memory of her still lived in the careful way he prepared meals, the orderly arrangement of herbs and medicines, the gentle manner he'd developed caring for living things. She would have approved of his rescuing this stranger, would have insisted on it, even if it meant danger. The woman stirred, and Caleb set down the piece of pine he'd been whittling. Her eyes opened, slowly, grey eyes that seemed older than her face, which he guessed at no more than 40 years. She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the pillow. "Easy now," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "You've been through quite an ordeal." She looked around the cabin, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the crackling fire, the simple furnishings that spoke of a man's solitary existence. Her gaze lingered on him, this tall, broad-shouldered stranger with kind eyes and careful hands. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "My cabin, about 20 miles northeast of Missoula, up in the high country." He poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup. "You were near frozen when I found you. Been sleeping for 3 days." She accepted the water gratefully, her hands shaking slightly as she drank. "I remember the snow, and you carried me. Seemed like the thing to do." He settled into his chair, maintaining a respectful distance. "Don't get many visitors up here, especially not in wedding dresses." A flush crept across her pale cheeks. She looked down at the simple wool dress she now wore, one of his old shirts altered to fit her. "My clothes, ruined from the cold and wet, had to get you into something dry." His tone was matter-of-fact, professional. "I've got some experience with exposure cases." She nodded, then seemed to remember something. "What I said when you found me. About being my wife if I carried you home." He leaned back, studying her with those steady brown eyes. "Figured you were half out of your head with cold. People say all sorts of things when they're dying." "I wasn't dying." Her voice grew stronger. "And I meant what I said." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. That's quite an offer, from a woman whose name I don't even know. Margaret Sullivan. She hesitated. Maggie. Caleb Harlan. He nodded toward the window, where snow continued to fall steadily. Well, Maggie Sullivan, you're welcome to stay until the weather breaks and you're strong enough to travel. After that, we can talk about whatever arrangement you have in mind. The days that followed settled into a careful routine. Caleb tended his traps and checked his snares, always returning by midday to ensure Maggie was comfortable. She proved to be a quick healer, though he noticed how she startled at sudden sounds and the way her eyes would go distant sometimes, as if seeing things that weren't there. She was clearly educated, her speech refined, her manners those of a woman raised with advantages. Yet there was something brittle about her, as if she'd been bent nearly to the breaking point. She never mentioned the wedding dress or the circumstances that had brought her to his mountain, and he respected her silence. "You read much?" she asked one evening, eyeing his collection of books. "When the snow's too deep for much else. Shakespeare, mostly. Some philosophy. Whatever the traders bring through." He glanced at her. "You. I was a schoolteacher before." She stopped herself. "I love books." "Help yourself. Been a while since I had someone to discuss them with." She chose Hamlet, and they spent the evening talking about duty and revenge, about the weight of the past and the possibility of redemption. Her insights were sharp, her observations nuanced. Whatever had driven her to his mountain, she was no simple frontier wife seeking security. "Your chess set," she said, noticing the carved pieces positioned mid-game on a small table. "Do you play against yourself?" "Mostly. Sometimes I pretend I'm playing my father. He taught me when I was young." Caleb moved a knight, considering the board. "Care for a game?" She proved to be a formidable opponent, her strategy patient and considered. As they played, he found himself studying her hands soft, but not pampered. There were small scars on her fingers and calluses that spoke of work, though not the hard labor of frontier life. "You're wondering about me," she said, capturing his bishop. "A man learns to mind his own business up here, but I'll admit to curiosity about how a schoolteacher ends up half frozen in a wedding dress 20 miles from anywhere." Maggie was quiet for several moves, her grey eyes focused on the board. Finally, she spoke. "Sometimes a woman finds herself with nowhere left to run except into the wilderness, and sometimes she finds exactly what she needs there." Their eyes met across the chessboard, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or simply the recognition of two souls who'd both known loss. The snow continued to fall, sealing them in their mountain sanctuary. Maggie grew stronger each day, taking over the cooking and mending with a skill that spoke of years of practice. The cabin, which had been merely functional under Caleb's solitary care, began to feel like a home. She made bread that filled the small space with warmth and the scent of yeast. She organized his medical supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd tended injuries before. Most importantly, she brought conversation and companionship to a life that had grown too quiet. "You mentioned an arrangement," Caleb said one evening as they sat by the fire, she with her mending and he carving a new handle for his axe. "I meant what I said in the snow." Her needle didn't pause in its steady rhythm. "If you can carry me home, I'll be your wife." "This is home." She looked around the cabin at the books they'd discussed, the chess set with their ongoing game, the simple furniture that had become familiar. "It could be. Marriage is more than just sharing a roof, Maggie. I know what marriage is." There was something hard in her voice now, a bitterness that hadn't been there before. "I know what it can be, and I know what it should be." He set down his carving, giving her his full attention. "What are you running from?" She met his gaze steadily. "What are you hiding from?" The question hung between them, like smoke from the fire. After a long moment, Caleb picked up his work again. "Fair enough. We've all got our ghosts. The difference is, mine might come looking." The wind howled outside their walls, driving snow against the windows with the sound of thrown sand. Inside, the fire crackled, and the oil lamp cast warm circles of light. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, each wondering what the spring might bring. Maggie finished her mending and folded the shirt carefully. "Caleb?" "Yes? Thank you for carrying me home." He looked at her, then really looked at her. The hollow-eyed desperation had faded from her face, replaced by something steadier. She was still pale, still too thin, but there was strength in the set of her shoulders and determination in the line of her jaw. "You're welcome," he said simply. Outside, the wind sang its winter song, and inside, two lonely souls continued the careful dance of learning to trust again. The chess game waited on its table, half finished, like the conversation they'd started and the life they might build together if they could both find the courage to try. Spring was still months away, but already something was changing in the high country. Something that had nothing to do with seasons and everything to do with the possibility that even broken hearts could learn to beat in harmony again. The revelation came on a morning when the snow had finally stopped and pale sunlight streamed through the cabin windows. Maggie was washing dishes in the basin, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows, when Caleb noticed the dark marks around her wrists, finger-shaped bruises that had faded to yellow-green but were still visible against her pale skin. He'd seen such marks before, during his years as a soldier. The pattern was unmistakable. "Maggie." Something in his voice made her turn, her hands still dripping soapy water. When she saw his expression, she quickly pulled her sleeves down, but it was too late. "How long?" he asked quietly. She didn't pretend to misunderstand. Her shoulders sagged, as if a weight she'd been carrying had suddenly become too heavy to bear. 3 years of marriage. It got worse after the first year. Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd assumed she was a widow, or perhaps abandoned by a husband who'd found another woman. This was something else entirely. "He thinks I'm dead," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The storm, everyone saw me leave the church. They'll have found my horse by the creek, probably think I fell through the ice trying to cross. You're still married." It wasn't a question. "Legally, yes." She dried her hands on a dish towel, her movements careful and controlled, but not in any way that matters to God or conscience. Caleb moved to the window, looking out at the pristine wilderness that had been his sanctuary for 30 years. "What's his name?" "Thomas Brennan. He owns the lumber mill in Missoula. Respectable businessman, pillar of the community." The bitterness in her voice could have etched glass. "Everyone thinks he's a fine man, kind to his workers, generous to the church. They don't see what happens behind closed doors. The wedding dress. I was supposed to renew our vows, 3 years of marriage, and he wanted a ceremony to show the whole town what a devoted husband he was." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I couldn't do it. Couldn't stand there in white and promise to love and honor a man who—" Her voice broke. Caleb turned from the window. Maggie stood by the table, her hands gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her grey eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her chin was raised in defiance. "So you ran?" "I ran. In my wedding dress, in a snowstorm, with no plan except to get as far away as possible." She met his gaze steadily. "I would have died out there if you hadn't found me. Maybe that would have been better." "Don't say that." The sharpness in his voice surprised them both. "Don't ever say that." "Why? Because it makes you uncomfortable to hear the truth?" The words came out harsh, edged with pain. "I'm a runaway wife, Caleb. In the eyes of the law, I'm his property. If he finds me, he won't." "You don't understand. Thomas doesn't give up things that belong to him. He'll look for me, and he has money and connections. The sheriff is his cousin. The judge plays poker at his house every week." Her voice grew smaller. "If he finds me, he'll drag me back, and it'll be worse than before. Much worse." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd told him. When he'd found her in the snow, he'd thought he was saving a woman in distress. Now he understood the true nature of her situation and his own. "Does he know about this place?" "I don't think so. I've never mentioned you, never talked about the high country. But Thomas is thorough, if he suspects I'm alive." She shuddered. "Let me get this straight. Caleb's voice was calm, measured. "You're legally married to a man who beats you. You faked your own death to escape him. And now you're asking me to hide you from the law." "I'm not asking anything." Pride flashed in her eyes. "I made you an offer in the snow, and I'll honor it if you'll have me. But I won't lie to you about what that means. If you take me as your wife, you'll be harboring a fugitive. You'll be breaking the law. And if I don't, then when the snow melts, I'll move on. Find somewhere else to hide, or—" She didn't finish the sentence. Caleb moved to the mantel, his fingers brushing the small wooden box he kept there. Inside were Martha's wedding ring and a lock of her hair, all he had left of the woman who'd taught him what real love could be. She'd been gentle and kind, nothing like this fierce, damaged woman who'd stumbled into his life. But Martha had also been strong when strength was needed, and she'd never tolerated injustice. "Show me," he said quietly. "What?" "The bruises. All of them." Maggie's face went pale, but after a moment's hesitation, she began to unbutton her sleeves. The marks on her wrists were the least of it. There were finger-shaped bruises on her upper arms, faded impressions around her throat, and when she pulled her collar aside, he could see the shadow of what had once been a handprint on her shoulder. Caleb had seen the aftermath of violence many times during the war, but this deliberate, calculated cruelty made his jaw clench with anger. These weren't the random injuries of a fight or accident. They spoke of systematic abuse, of a man who enjoyed causing pain. How long since he last? The night before the ceremony. He was angry because I'd tried to back out, said things needed to be fresh in my mind for the wedding. She began buttoning her sleeves again with steady hands. That's when I knew I couldn't go through with it, couldn't stand at that altar and pretend. Good. The word came out harder than he'd intended. Any woman with sense would have done the same. Would she? Maggie's laugh was brittle. The church teaches that wives should submit to their husbands. The law says I belong to him. Most people would say I should have honored my vows. Most people are fools. Caleb moved away from the mantel, his decision made. You said if I carried you home, you'd be my wife. I carried you home. Caleb, I'm 60 years old, Maggie. I've lived alone for 30 years, and I've made my peace with it. But I won't turn out a woman who needs protection, and I won't send her back to a man who treats her like that. He gestured toward her concealed bruises. The offer you made in the snow, does it still stand? Yes. The word came out as barely a whisper. Then I accept. We'll make it legal as soon as we can find a preacher who'll perform the ceremony without asking too many questions. Until then, you're under my protection. You don't know what you're saying. If Thomas finds out, then he'll have to deal with me. There was something in Caleb's voice that hadn't been there before, something that spoke of old skills and hard experience. I may be a hermit, Maggie, but I'm not defenseless. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or hesitation. What she saw there must have reassured her, because some of the tension left her shoulders. There's something else you should know, she said quietly. Thomas has money, and he's not afraid to use it. If he decides I'm alive and comes looking, he won't come alone. He'll bring men hired guns, probably. He has connections in places that would surprise you. Let him come. Caleb's tone was matter of fact, as if they were discussing the weather. This is my mountain, and I know every trail, every hiding place, every approach. Any man fool enough to come up here looking for trouble will find more than he bargained for. I don't want you to have to fight because of me. Maybe not, but sometimes a fight comes whether you want it or not. He moved to the rifle rack, checking the action on his Winchester with practiced efficiency. The question isn't whether I'm willing to fight. The question is whether you're willing to stay and build something worth fighting for. Maggie looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary at this quiet man who'd risked everything to protect a stranger. When she spoke, her voice was steady and sure. Yes, she said, I'm willing to stay. Outside, the wind had picked up again, but inside the cabin, two people had just committed themselves to a path that would change both their lives forever. The wedding ring, hidden in Maggie's belongings, the one she'd never removed, more from fear than sentiment, suddenly felt like a chain she was finally ready to break. The morning after Maggie's revelation, Caleb woke before dawn and found her already sitting by the dying fire, fully dressed and staring into the embers. She looked up when he stirred, and he saw that she hadn't slept. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, pulling on his boots. "About staying?" "No." She stood and moved to the window, where the first pale light was beginning to touch the mountain peaks. "But I keep thinking about what happens when spring comes, about whether you really understand what you've agreed to." "I understand plenty." He joined her at the window, close enough to feel the tension radiating from her small frame. "But there's something you need to understand too. If you're going to survive up here, really survive, not just hide, you need to know how to take care of yourself. I can cook and clean and mend." "That's not what I mean." He moved to a wooden chest in the corner and lifted the lid, revealing an assortment of items she hadn't seen before. "These mountains don't care if you're a lady or a school teacher or a runaway wife. They'll kill you just as quick as they'd kill anyone else. If something happens to me, you need to be able to survive on your own." He pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was worn smooth by countless hands, and the binding was reinforced with careful stitching. "This belonged to my father. Everything he learned about living in the wilderness is in here. How to read weather signs, which plants are safe to eat, how to track game and avoid predators." He handed it to her, noting how reverently she accepted it. "He taught me, and now I'm going to teach you." Over the following days, Caleb began Maggie's education in mountain survival. They started with the basics: how to build and maintain a fire in wind and wet weather, how to find water in winter, how to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. She proved to be an eager student, her teacher's instincts helping her organize and retain the information he shared. "See how the smoke from the chimney is blowing?" he said one afternoon as they stood outside the cabin. "Straight up means calm weather. If it starts to bend east, we'll have wind from the west within the hour. If it flattens out completely, there's a storm coming fast." Maggie studied the thin column of grey smoke rising into the clear sky. "How do you know which direction is which without a compass? Moss grows thicker on the north side of trees. Snow melts faster on southern slopes. And see that peak there?" He pointed to a distinctive mountain in the distance. "That's been my landmark for 30 years. Once you know where you are in relation to fixed points, you can always find your way." She absorbed these lessons with the same focused attention she'd once given to teaching children their letters. But Caleb noticed that she jumped at unexpected sounds: the crack of a branch in the wind, the distant call of a hawk. Her eyes would dart to the tree line, searching for threats that weren't there. "You don't have to be afraid," he said one evening as they sat by the fire. She absorbed in his father's journal while he worked on repairing a trap. "I'm not afraid." The words came out too quickly. "Maggie." He set down his tools and looked at her directly. "Fear's not a weakness. It kept you alive long enough to get away from that bastard. But you can't live in it forever." She closed the journal carefully, her finger marking her place. "It's hard to believe I'm really safe. For 3 years, I was always watching, always waiting for the next." She stopped herself. "Tell me about before you married him." For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she settled back in her chair, her voice taking on a softer quality than he'd heard before. "I taught at the school in Helena, had my own little house, my own life. I loved those children. Some of them came from families that barely had enough to eat, but they were so eager to learn." A small smile touched her lips. "There was this one boy. Jamie couldn't have been more than 7. He'd walk 3 miles each way just to sit in my classroom and listen to stories." "What happened to that life?" "Thomas came to town on business. Lumber contracts with the railroad. He was charming, well-dressed, said all the right things." Her voice grew bitter. "I thought I was lucky to catch the attention of such a successful man. My friends all said so. And after the wedding, he moved me to Missoula, said I didn't need to work anymore. At first, I thought it was generous, a husband who wanted to take care of his wife. But then I realized he didn't want me to have anything that was mine alone. No job, no friends he didn't approve of, no money of my own. She stared into the fire. That's when the real Thomas started to show. Caleb had been whittling as she spoke, his knife working automatically while he listened. The piece of pine in his hands was taking the shape of a small bird, a robin, perhaps, or a sparrow. You miss teaching. Every day. There's something about watching a child's face when they understand something new, when the world suddenly makes sense in a way it didn't before. She glanced at him. What did you do before? Before the mountain? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he set down his carving and met her eyes. I was a soldier. Cavalry, mostly. Fought in the war. He gestured vaguely eastward. Afterward, I came west with my wife. We planned to start a ranch, raise horses maybe, build something peaceful. What happened to her? Fever took her the second winter we were here. I'd gone down to town for supplies, got caught in a blizzard for 4 days. When I made it back, his voice trailed off. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago, but that's when I decided the mountain was enough company for me. Until now. They sat in comfortable silence, the fire crackling between them and the wind singing its winter song outside their walls. Maggie picked up the journal again, but Caleb noticed she was watching him more than reading. The bird, she said, nodding toward his carving. It's beautiful. He looked down at the small wooden robin in his hands, surprised to see how detailed it had become while his attention was elsewhere. My father taught me this too. Said a man's hands should always be making something useful or beautiful. May I? She held out her hand. He placed the carving in her palm, noting how carefully she cradled it. Her fingers traced the delicate lines he'd carved to suggest feathers, the tiny beak he'd shaped with patient precision. It looks ready to fly away. Maybe that's the point. Some things are meant to be free. Their eyes met across the small space, and something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. She was like that bird, perhaps. Something beautiful that had been caged too long, only now beginning to remember what freedom felt like. Caleb? Yes? Thank you. For all of this. For teaching me. For protecting me. For seeing me as more than just a burden or a problem to be solved. You're not a burden, Maggie. He paused, choosing his words carefully. You're the first good thing to happen to this mountain in 30 years. Outside, an owl called across the darkness, its voice echoing off the peaks that surrounded their small sanctuary. Inside, 2 people continued the slow work of learning to trust not just each other, but the possibility that even damaged hearts could heal when given time and tenderness. February arrived with a blizzard that lasted 3 days, sealing them inside the cabin with walls of white that reached nearly to the windows. The forced intimacy might have been awkward between strangers, but Caleb and Maggie had settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. She'd found an old photograph tucked between the pages of his father's journal, a faded image of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing beside a man who looked remarkably like a younger Caleb. When the storm finally broke and pale sunlight streamed through the windows again, she held it out to him. Your wife. Martha. He took the photograph carefully, his thumb tracing the edge where the paper had worn soft. This was taken just after we were married. She was barely 20 then. Maggie studied the image of the woman who'd loved Caleb before loneliness and mountain solitude had carved lines around his eyes. She was beautiful. Inside and out, never met anyone with a kinder heart. He looked up from the photograph. She would have liked you. How can you be sure? Because she always said the measure of a person wasn't what they had or where they came from, but how they treated others when they had nothing left to give. He slipped the photograph back into the journal. You've been through hell, Maggie, but you haven't let it make you cruel. Martha would have respected that. The compliment warmed her more than the fire, but it also stirred something uncomfortable, a fear that she wasn't worthy of such praise, that he was seeing something in her that didn't really exist. "You don't know everything about me," she said quietly. "I know enough." He moved to the stove, checking the pot of stew she'd prepared for their midday meal. "I know you read to me in the evenings, even though your voice gets tired. I know you mend my clothes with stitches so neat they're prettier than the original. I know you saved the last of the dried apples for me, even though I saw how much you wanted them." Heat rose in her cheeks. Those small kindnesses had seemed natural, barely worth noticing. But under his steady gaze, she realized they mattered more than she'd understood. Those things, they're nothing special. They are to a man who's lived 30 years without them. The afternoon brought the first real thaw they'd seen since her arrival. Water dripping steadily from the eaves and the sound of ice beginning to shift and crack on the nearby creek. Caleb took advantage of the milder weather to check his traplines, and for the first time since that first day, Maggie found herself alone in the cabin. She moved through the space slowly, seeing it with new eyes now that she knew more of its history. The careful organization wasn't just the habit of a solitary man, it was the tribute of a widower who'd preserved the home he'd shared with his wife. She could see Martha's influence in the way herbs were arranged on the shelves, in the placement of the rocking chair by the fire, in the small touches that made the cabin feel lived in rather than merely functional. In the wooden box on the mantel, she found more than just Martha's wedding ring and lock of hair. There were letters tied with a faded ribbon, their pages yellow with age. She didn't read them, that would have been a violation of privacy she couldn't justify, but she could see they were love letters, written in a feminine hand that spoke of education and care. When Caleb returned near sunset, he found her sitting by the fire, with tears on her cheeks. "What's wrong?" I opened the box. "I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't have, but—" "It's all right." He hung his coat on its peg and moved to warm his hands by the fire. "What did you find?" "The letters. I didn't read them, but I could see." She looked up at him, her grey eyes bright with unshed tears. "You loved her so much." "Yes, I did. And I'm asking you to replace her memory with this. With me." Her voice broke slightly. "How can that be fair to either of you?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Martha's been gone 30 years, Maggie. For 30 years, I've kept her memory like a shrine, never letting anyone else close enough to disturb it. But that's not living, that's just existing." He moved to the mantel and opened the wooden box, lifting out Martha's ring. The simple gold band caught the firelight, warm and bright in his weathered palm. "Martha and I had 7 years together. 7 good years, cut short by circumstances beyond our control. What we had was real and precious, and nothing will ever change that." He looked at Maggie directly. "But that doesn't mean I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life as a monument to what I lost." "I'm not her," Maggie whispered. "No, you're not. You're yourself, strong in ways she never had to be, wounded in ways she never was, brave in ways I'm still discovering." He closed his hand around the ring. "I'm not asking you to be Martha, and I'm not trying to make you into someone else. I'm asking if you want to build something new with me, something that's ours." The simplicity of his words, the honest emotion behind them, broke through the wall of insecurity she'd been building. She stood and moved to him, close enough to see the silver threads in his hair, the lines that spoke of years spent squinting into mountain sun. "Yes," she said, "I want that." He reached out then, his hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. His thumb brushed away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "Then we'll take it one day at a time. No promises about forever, no grand declarations. Just 2 people sharing a life and seeing where it leads." When he kissed her, it was nothing like the desperate, possessive kisses Thomas had forced on her. This was gentle, questioning, a conversation rather than a demand. She felt herself lean into him, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. When they broke apart, she stayed close, her forehead resting against his shoulder. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" "Of being happy, of letting myself believe this is real." She pulled back to look at him. "Of what happens when spring comes and the outside world finds us." Spring's still months away. That's months to get stronger, to prepare, to decide what kind of life we want to build together. His hands settled on her shoulders, warm and steady. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Outside, the evening wind had picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter was far from over. But inside their sanctuary, something was changing. The careful distance they'd maintained was giving way to something warmer, more intimate. Not passion, not yet, but the quiet recognition that they were no longer strangers, sharing space, but partners beginning to share a life. That night, for the first time since her arrival, Maggie slept without dreams of Thomas or memories of pain. Instead, she dreamed of spring, of mountain meadows and clear skies, of a future that might actually be worth the risk of believing in it. March brought the first real signs of spring, patches of bare ground appearing where the snow had melted, the sound of running water growing stronger each day as the creek swelled with snowmelt. With the changing season came a restlessness in both Caleb and Maggie, an awareness that their mountain sanctuary wouldn't remain isolated forever. It was while gathering firewood that Maggie made the discovery that changed everything. She was stacking split logs in the woodshed when her hand brushed against something unexpected: papers tucked behind a loose board in the wall. When she pulled them free, she found herself holding military discharge papers, yellowed with age, but still legible. Captain Caleb Harlan, Twund, Montana Cavalry. Distinguished Service Cross. Honorable discharge. The formal language couldn't hide what the commendations revealed. This quiet mountain man had been a decorated officer, skilled in tactics and warfare. When Caleb returned from checking his traps, he found her sitting at the table with the papers spread before her. "I was looking for kindling," she said without preamble. "These were hidden in the woodshed." He looked at the documents, then at her face, reading the questions there. "That was a long time ago. Captain Harlan." She touched the papers gently. "Distinguished Service Cross. That's not given lightly." "No, it's not." He moved to hang up his coat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "What do you want to know? Why you never mentioned it? Why a decorated cavalry officer is living alone on a mountain like a hermit?" Caleb poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, adding a measure to a second cup for her. When he sat down across from her, his expression was thoughtful but not defensive. "Because the war's over, and the man who earned those commendations died with it. The man who came back, the man who buried his wife and built this cabin, he just wanted peace. But the skills you learned, the training, still there." His voice was matter of fact. "A man doesn't forget how to fight, how to read terrain, how to plan strategy. But knowing how to kill and choosing to do it are different things." Maggie studied his face, seeing him with new eyes. The careful way he moved, the unconscious manner in which he positioned himself to see both the door and windows, the methodical way he maintained his weapons, all of it spoke of military training that had never really left him. "When I told you Thomas might come with hired men, you weren't worried." "No, I wasn't, because you've faced worse. Much worse." He met her gaze steadily. "But I didn't want to scare you with talk of fighting and killing. You'd had enough of violence." "I'm not afraid of the truth, Caleb. I'm afraid of lies and half-truths, and men who hide what they really are." Her voice carried an edge that spoke of hard experience. "Thomas was always charming in public, always the perfect gentleman. It was only behind closed doors that I saw who he really was." "And you think I'm hiding something similar?" "I think you're a good man who's seen bad things and done what he had to do. I think you're trying to protect me from knowing how dangerous you can be." She reached across the table and touched his hand. "But I need to know. If we're going to face whatever's coming together, I need to understand what you're capable of." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his fingers intertwining with hers. Finally, he began to speak, his voice low and measured. I joined up when I was 19, thought it would be an adventure, a chance to see the country and serve something bigger than myself. The reality was different than the stories made it sound. He told her about battles fought in mud and blood, about decisions that meant life or death for the men under his command. He spoke of the weight of responsibility, of sleepless nights planning strategies that would bring his soldiers home alive. He described the aftermath of combat, the silence that followed gunfire, the faces of boys who'd never see another sunrise. The citation mentions a battle near the Yellowstone River, Maggie said, reading from the papers. What happened there? Confederate raiders had taken a settlement hostage, 30 families, including children. My orders were to wait for reinforcements, but by the time they arrived, those people would have been dead. His voice grew distant, remembering. I took 20 men and went in anyway. We got the hostages out, but it cost us dearly. How many men did you lose? 6. Good men, all of them. Boys who trusted me to bring them home. He looked at her directly. That's what the medal was, for saving those families. But 6 mothers got letters because of my decision. Sometimes I wonder if the trade was worth it. Maggie was quiet, absorbing what he'd told her. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. You saved 30 families, 90 people, maybe more, including children who grew up to have families of their own. The men who died, they made that choice too. They followed you because they believed in what you were doing. You sound very sure. I am sure, because I know you, Caleb Harlan. You're the kind of man who carries guilt for decisions that had no good options. You're the kind of man who spent 30 years on a mountain because you think you don't deserve peace. She squeezed his hand. But you do deserve it. And more than that, you deserve to be known for who you really are. And who am I, in your opinion? You're a protector. You always have been. In the war, you protected your men and those families. On this mountain, you protected yourself from more pain. And now, she smiled, the expression transforming her face. Now you're protecting me. Is that what you want? A protector? I want a partner, someone who's strong enough to stand with me, not someone who thinks I need to be sheltered from reality. Her grey eyes were clear and direct. Thomas tried to control me by keeping me weak and ignorant. I won't live that way again, even with someone I care about. The words hung between them, honest and challenging. Caleb studied her face, seeing the determination there, the strength that had carried her through 3 years of abuse and driven her to risk everything for freedom. All right, he said finally. No more secrets, no more protecting you from uncomfortable truths. If Thomas comes when he comes, you'll know exactly what we're facing and what I plan to do about it. Thank you. But Maggie, his voice carried a gravity that made her look up. If it comes to a fight, if men come here meaning to hurt you or drag you back to that life, I won't hesitate to do whatever's necessary to stop them. That's not a threat or a boast. It's a promise. She nodded, understanding the weight of what he was telling her. I know, and I'm grateful for it. Outside, the wind carried the scent of warming earth and melting snow. Spring was coming, whether they were ready or not, bringing with it the possibility of discovery and confrontation. But inside the cabin, 2 people had just taken another step toward true partnership, sharing the kind of honesty that real love required. By April, the mountain trails had become passable again, and Caleb made his first trip to town since finding Maggie in the snow. She'd wanted to come with him, but they'd both agreed it was too risky, too many chances of being recognized, too many questions that would be difficult to answer. He returned 3 days later with supplies and troubling news. There's been talk, he said, unloading flour and coffee from his pack. Questions about a missing woman from Missoula. Her husband's been making inquiries, offering a reward for information. Maggie's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. How much? $500. The amount was staggering, more money than most people in these parts saw in a year. Maggie felt something cold settle in her stomach. Thomas was serious about finding her, serious enough to spend a fortune doing it. What kind of questions? The usual. Description. Last known whereabouts. But he's been clever about it, says his wife wandered off in a snowstorm, that she's been acting strange since a head injury last fall. Makes it sound like she's confused, maybe dangerous to herself. People believe that. Some do. Others. Caleb paused in his unpacking. Others remember that his first wife died under mysterious circumstances. Fell down the stairs, they said, but there were whispers. Maggie's blood went cold. His first wife? Sarah Mitchell. They were married about 8 years before he met you. Died 2 years into the marriage. Caleb's voice was carefully neutral. The doctor called it an accident, but her sister had doubts. He told me she died of consumption. Maggie's voice was barely a whisper. Said it was a long illness. Very sad. Maybe he thought the truth would scare you off. It would have. She set down her mending with shaking hands. Dear God, Caleb, what if I wasn't the first? We don't know anything for certain. Could be nothing more than small-town gossip. But his tone suggested he didn't believe that any more than she did. Maggie stood and moved to the window, staring out at the mountain peaks that had become her sanctuary. The beauty that had comforted her for months now felt fragile, temporary. He'll never stop looking, not if he killed one wife and lost another. Too many questions, too much attention. She turned back to Caleb. Maybe I should go. Find somewhere else to hide, somewhere far away where he'll never think to look. Running didn't work the first time. No, but staying put might get you killed. Her voice rose with a fear she'd been trying to suppress. I won't be responsible for that. Caleb moved to her, his hands settling on her shoulders with the steady pressure she'd come to depend on. You're not responsible for his choices, Maggie. Not his violence, not his obsession, not what he might do to find you. But I brought this to your door. You brought yourself to my door. Half-frozen and desperate, asking for nothing more than shelter. His brown eyes were calm, resolved. The rest of it, the danger, the complications, those are his doing, not yours. From his pack, he pulled out a small leather pouch that clinked softly when he set it on the table. Maggie stared at it, recognizing what it represented. My emergency money, she said. I hid it in my dress that night. You found it. Figured you might want it back. $200, gold and silver both. He opened the pouch, revealing the carefully hoarded coins she'd saved over 3 years of marriage, money skimmed from household accounts, hidden away against the day she might need to run. That's a lot of planning for a woman who supposedly had a head injury. You know, I was thinking about leaving long before that night. I know you're smarter and braver than he gave you credit for. Question is, what do you want to do with that intelligence now? Maggie picked up one of the gold coins, turning it over in her palm. Each piece represented a small act of rebellion, a step toward the freedom she'd finally claimed in that snowstorm. In town, she said slowly, did anyone seem to believe his story about the head injury? Some, but others, older women, mostly, women who've seen how the world treats wives, they had doubts. Mrs. Henderson at the general store asked pointed questions about why a loving husband would let his confused wife wander out in a blizzard. And what did you tell her? That I didn't know anything about any missing women, but that I hoped she was safe wherever she was. Caleb's expression was grim. Mrs. Henderson's a sharp one. I think she suspected there was more to the story. Hope stirred in Maggie's chest, fragile, tentative, but real. You think people might be willing to listen to the truth? Some might, but that's a dangerous game, Maggie. Once you surface, once you start telling your story, there's no going back to hiding. Thomas will know exactly where you are. He's going to find me anyway, isn't he? The reward money, the search, he's too determined to give up. Probably. Caleb's honesty was brutal but necessary. Question is whether you want to face him on his terms or yours. Maggie moved to the fireplace, staring into the flames that had warmed her through the long winter months. When she spoke, her voice was steady, decided. I want to go to town. I want to tell people the truth about Thomas Brennan and what kind of man he really is. That's a brave choice. Also, a potentially foolish one. Maybe. But I'm tired of hiding, tired of letting him control my life, even from a distance. She turned to face him. I spent 3 years being afraid, and 4 months hiding. I won't spend the rest of my life running from shadows. And if he comes for you, if he brings men with guns and legal papers that say you belong to him, then we'll deal with that when it happens. Together. She moved to him, reaching up to touch his face. You said no more secrets, no more protecting me from uncomfortable truths. This is my choice to make. It is, but it's mine too. His hand covered hers. If we do this, if we go to town and you tell your story, then we do it right. We find allies. We make sure people understand what really happened, and we prepare for whatever comes next. A campaign. Exactly. Like any military operation, good intelligence, careful planning, reliable allies. His smile was grim but determined. Thomas Brennan wants a fight? We'll give him one, but it'll be on our terms, not his. Outside, a hawk circled high above the valley, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. Maggie watched it for a moment, envying its freedom, its ability to see the whole landscape spread out below. When do we start? Tomorrow. We'll ride down together, and you'll tell your story to anyone willing to listen. Caleb's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to command. But tonight, we plan, because once we light this fuse, there's no telling how big the explosion will be. The morning they planned to ride to town, everything changed. Maggie was preparing bread for their journey when she heard the sound that made her blood freeze, the distinctive jingle of harness and the steady rhythm of multiple horses climbing the mountain trail. She moved to the window and felt her world tilt on its axis. Thomas Brennan sat his horse like a man accustomed to being obeyed, his expensive coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the rough mountain setting. Behind him rode 3 other men, hard-faced strangers with the look of hired guns. But it was the 5th rider that made Maggie's knees weak. Sheriff William Crenshaw wore his badge like armor, and in his hand was an official-looking document that could only mean one thing. "Caleb," she whispered. He was beside her instantly, taking in the scene below with the tactical assessment of his military training. 5 men. Sheriff's got papers, which means this isn't just a search party. What kind of papers? Probably a warrant for your return, maybe charges against me for harboring a fugitive wife. His voice was calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Thomas has been busy. Through the window, they watched as the sheriff unfolded what appeared to be an official telegram. Even at a distance, they could see the government seal. "Federal marshals will be here by week's end," Sheriff Crenshaw called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "You've got until then to return, Mrs. Brennan, to her lawful husband. After that, this becomes a federal matter." Maggie felt the walls of their sanctuary closing in around her. "Federal marshals. Thomas has connections you didn't know about," Caleb said grimly. "Political ones, by the look of it." Below them, Thomas dismounted and handed his reins to one of his men. Even from a distance, Maggie could see the cold satisfaction on his face. He'd found her, and he'd come with enough legal authority to make resistance seem impossible. "Margaret!" Thomas's voice rang out across the clearing. "I know you're in there. I've come to take you home." Caleb moved away from the window, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. "How well do you know the sheriff?" "Well enough. He's Thomas's cousin, his mother's sister's boy. They grew up together." Maggie's voice was hollow with defeat. "He'll do whatever Thomas asks." "And the federal angle?" "Thomas has contracts with the railroad, connections in Helena and Denver. I knew he had influence, but this—" She gestured toward the window. "This is more than I imagined." The sheriff's voice carried up to them again, formal and final. "Mr. Harlan, you're harboring a woman who's been declared mentally incompetent by a territorial judge. Her husband has legal guardianship and the authority to retrieve her. You have 10 minutes to send her out, or we'll come in and get her." "Mentally incompetent?" Maggie's voice cracked. He had me declared insane? Caleb's jaw tightened as the implications sank in. A woman declared mentally incompetent, had no legal rights, no standing to make her own choices. Her testimony about abuse would be dismissed as the ravings of a damaged mind. "It's a neat trick," he said, his soldier's mind analyzing the tactical situation. "Can't argue with a legal document, can't fight federal authority. He's boxed us in completely. I have to go with them." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. "If I don't, they'll arrest you. They might even claim you kidnapped me." "Like hell." "Caleb, be reasonable. You can't fight the federal government. You can't. Watch me." But even as he said it, they both knew the truth. This wasn't a situation that could be solved with military tactics or mountain wisdom. Thomas had used the legal system itself as a weapon, and there was no defense against it. Thomas's voice rose again, carrying a note of mock concern that made Maggie's skin crawl. "Margaret, darling, I know you're frightened and confused. The doctor says that's normal after a head injury. But I'm here now, and I'm going to take care of you." "The bastard's playing to an audience," Caleb observed, making sure the sheriff hears how concerned and caring he is. "It doesn't matter. The papers are legal. The authority is real." Maggie moved toward the door, her decision made. "I won't let you become a fugitive because of me." "Maggie, wait." "No." She turned to face him, her grey eyes bright with unshed tears, but her voice steady. "You saved my life once. You gave me months of peace and safety, and something that felt like love. Don't throw your life away now, for something that was always going to end this way." She moved to the wooden chest where she kept her few possessions, pulling out the simple dress she'd been wearing when he found her. Her hands shook as she began to change out of the comfortable clothes that had marked her time of freedom. "There has to be another way," Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction. 5 minutes, the sheriff called out. Maggie finished dressing and moved to the mirror, trying to arrange her hair in the style Thomas preferred. The woman looking back at her was different from the one who'd fled into the snowstorm, stronger, more self-possessed, marked by months of healing. But none of that would matter once she walked out that door. "The money," she said suddenly, remembering the leather pouch on the table. "Hide it. Don't let them know about it. What are you planning?" "I don't know yet. But if I survive this, if I find another chance to run, I'll need resources." She picked up the wooden robin he'd carved for her, running her fingers over its delicate features one last time. "Keep this. Remember that some things are meant to be free. Maggie, promise me." Her voice was fierce, desperate. "Promise me you'll remember that this isn't over, that whatever happens now, whatever he does to me, this isn't the end of the story." Outside, they could hear the sound of boots on the cabin's front steps. "I promise," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. She kissed him then, quickly and fiercely, trying to memorize the feel of his lips, the warmth of his hands, the safety of his arms around her. When she pulled away, her face was set with a determination that hadn't been there when he first found her. "Time's up!" The sheriff's voice was accompanied by heavy knocking on the door. Maggie squared her shoulders and walked to the door, every step an act of will. When she opened it, Thomas was waiting on the other side, his face a mask of false concern and barely concealed triumph. "Hello, Margaret," he said, his voice honey-sweet and utterly cold. "It's time to come home." Behind him, the sheriff held up the official papers, federal documents that made resistance legally impossible. But in Thomas's eyes, Maggie could see the promise of punishment, the guarantee that her months of freedom would be paid for in pain. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll come willingly." "Good girl." Thomas's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I knew you'd see reason eventually." As they escorted her toward the horses, Maggie caught one last glimpse of Caleb standing in the cabin doorway. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes promised things that legal documents couldn't prevent. She held on to that promise as Thomas helped her onto a horse, his hands deliberately rough, his grip a preview of what awaited her. The ride down the mountain felt like a funeral procession, but Maggie kept her head high and her eyes forward. She'd learned something important during her months of freedom. She was stronger than she'd known, braver than she'd believed. Whatever Thomas had planned for her, she would survive it. And somehow, someday, she would find her way back to the mountain and the man who'd taught her what freedom tasted like. For 3 days after they took Maggie away, Caleb moved through his cabin like a ghost. Every object reminded him of her presence. The mended shirt draped over her chair, the book she'd been reading left open on the table, the faint scent of lavender soap that still lingered on the pillow where she'd slept. On the 4th day, he stopped wallowing and started planning. The wooden box on the mantel had held Martha's memory for 30 years, but now it served a different purpose. Inside, beneath the letters and photographs, was a collection of items that spoke to a different side of his past, coded messages from former soldiers, a network of men who'd served under his command and scattered across the territories when the war ended. His first message went to Jim Crawford, now a territorial marshal in Helena. The second to Patrick O'Brien, who ran freight contracts between mining towns and had contacts throughout the region. The third to Dr. Samuel Hayes, who'd served as a field surgeon and now practiced medicine in Denver, where he'd treated too many wives with suspicious injuries to believe in accidents. Each message was brief, coded in the language they'd developed during the war. But the meaning was clear. Captain Harlan needed assistance, and the cause was just. While he waited for replies, Caleb made his own reconnaissance trips to town, gathering intelligence with the patience his military training had instilled. What he learned made his blood run cold. Thomas had installed Maggie in their house like a prisoner. The windows were barred ostensibly for her own protection, given her fragile mental state, and a hired nurse named Mrs. Dalton watched her every moment. Dr. Fleming, the local physician, had been brought in to examine her and had pronounced her condition delicate but stable, whatever that meant. But it was the talk among the women in town that told the real story. Maggie had been seen only once since her return, at Sunday service, where she'd sat silent and pale beside Thomas, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on nothing. The bruises on her arms were blamed on her condition, the tendency to hurt herself that came with mental fragility. "She don't look right," Mrs. Henderson confided to Caleb during one of his supply runs. "Thin as a rail and jumpy as a cat. Whatever happened to her up on that mountain must have been terrible to leave her in such a state." Caleb bit his tongue rather than correct her assumption. The story Thomas had spread painted him as either a kidnapper who'd taken advantage of a confused woman, or at best a hermit who'd been too simple to realize she needed proper medical care. Either way, he was the villain in the narrative, and Maggie was the victim who'd been rescued from his rough mountain ways. The replies to his messages began arriving by the end of the week, carried by riders who knew how to find him without being seen. The news they brought was both encouraging and sobering. Jim Crawford's message was characteristically direct, federal involvement puzzling, no official request filed through proper channels, someone pulling strings behind scenes, investigating. Patrick O'Brien had traced the connections that allowed Thomas to claim federal authority. Railroad contracts tied to territorial governor's office, governor's wife sister to federal judge in Denver. Money and influence buying favors at highest levels. But it was Dr. Hayes's message that provided the most useful intelligence. Examined first wife's body after death. Injuries consistent with prolonged abuse, not accidental fall. Local coroner intimidated into silence. Have documentation. Can testify if needed. Caleb spread the messages on his table like a general planning a campaign. The situation was complex, but not hopeless. Thomas's power came from connections and money, not legitimate authority. The federal angle was a bluff, impressive but ultimately hollow. But dismantling it would require more than mountain fighting skills. It would take strategy, timing, and allies. The most detailed intelligence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Dalton, the hired nurse, had a nephew who'd served under Caleb during the war. Private Jake Morrison had lost his left arm at Gettysburg, and Caleb had personally carried him to safety when the boy was too injured to walk. The debt of gratitude had never been forgotten. Through Jake, Mrs. Dalton sent word that Maggie was alive, but suffering. Thomas kept her sedated during the day with laudanum, claiming it calmed her nervous condition. At night, when the drug wore off, she was locked in her room while Thomas entertained business associates downstairs, playing the role of the tragic husband burdened with a mentally ill wife. "She's fighting it," Jake reported during a clandestine meeting in the woods outside town. "Mrs. Dalton says she refuses to eat the food they bring, knows it's drugged. She's getting weaker, but she's still fighting. How long can she hold out?" "Not long." Thomas is getting impatient, talking about having her committed to an asylum in Denver. "Once she's there." Jake didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what happened to women who disappeared into territorial asylums. When? Soon. Maybe within the week. He's already been making inquiries. That night, Caleb sat by his fire and made the hardest decision of his life. Everything he'd built on this mountain, the peace, the solitude, the carefully constructed life that had sustained him for 30 years, would have to be sacrificed. But some things were worth more than personal safety. He opened the wooden chest one more time, removing items he hadn't touched since the war. His captain's bars, tarnished but unmistakable. Letters of commendation that established his character and service record. And most importantly, a particular document that few people knew existed, a presidential pardon for actions taken during wartime that had technically violated civilian law. The next morning brought visitors. Jim Crawford arrived first, his marshal's badge giving him authority that even Thomas would have to respect. Doc Hayes came on the noon stage, carrying a medical bag and a reputation that stretched throughout the territories. Patrick O'Brien rode in with a freight wagon that contained more than supplies hidden among the legitimate cargo, were men who'd served under Caleb's command and were prepared to serve again. They gathered in the church after evening service, when the building was empty and their conversation couldn't be overheard. Reverend Mills, a soft-spoken man with steel in his backbone, had agreed to let them use the space after Mrs. Henderson convinced him that justice was at stake. "The legal situation is complicated," Jim Crawford began, spreading documents on the altar like evidence in a trial. "Thomas has been clever about creating the appearance of federal authority, but it's all built on favors and connections. The actual paperwork wouldn't stand up to serious scrutiny." "What about the competency ruling?" Dr. Hayes asked. "Issued by a territorial judge who's never examined the patient, based solely on Thomas's testimony and Dr. Fleming's assessment." Crawford's expression was grim. "Dr. Fleming, by the way, has gambling debts that Thomas has been known to cover." "So the whole thing is corrupt," Patrick O'Brien observed. "Question is, how do we prove it without getting ourselves arrested in the process?" Caleb had been quiet during this exchange, studying the faces of the men who'd answered his call. These were good men, honorable men, but they were asking them to risk everything on his word that Maggie was worth saving. "There's something else," he said finally, "something that changes everything." He told them about Dr. Hayes's findings regarding Thomas's first wife, about the pattern of abuse that had likely killed one woman and was slowly destroying another. He described the bruises he'd seen on Maggie's body, the fear in her eyes, the desperation that had driven her into a blizzard rather than face another day of marriage. "This isn't about one woman's freedom," he concluded. "It's about stopping a man who's killed before and will kill again. If we don't act now, Maggie won't survive another month." The silence that followed was heavy with decision. Finally, Reverend Mills spoke up. "What do you need us to do?" The plan they developed was complex, requiring precise timing and coordination. Dr. Hayes would request an independent medical examination, using his professional reputation to demand access to Maggie. Jim Crawford would challenge the federal authority angle, demanding to see the actual paperwork. Patrick O'Brien would spread word among the business community about Thomas's first wife and the suspicious circumstances of her death. But the key element was something only Caleb could provide: a direct confrontation that would force Thomas to reveal his true nature in front of witnesses who couldn't be bought or intimidated. "It's dangerous," Jim Crawford warned. "If this goes wrong, we could all end up in federal prison." "If we do nothing," Caleb replied, "a woman dies and a killer continues to walk free. Sometimes the choice isn't between safe and dangerous, it's between right and wrong." As the meeting broke up, each man knowing his role in the coming confrontation, Caleb felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. It had been 30 years since he'd led men into battle, but the principles remained the same: clear objectives, reliable intelligence, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the cause. Tomorrow, they would begin the campaign to save Maggie's life. Tonight, he would prepare for war. The confrontation began at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, when Dr. Hayes knocked on Thomas Brennan's front door with the authority of medical science behind him. "I'm here to conduct an independent examination of Mrs. Brennan," he announced when Thomas answered, his voice carrying the crisp professionalism that had made him one of the most respected physicians in the territory. "I've been retained by the Territorial Medical Board to assess her condition." Thomas's face went through several expressions before settling on polite confusion. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Doctor. My wife is under the care of Dr. Fleming, who's been treating her condition since her return." Dr. Fleming's assessment has been questioned by his peers. Given the serious nature of Mrs. Brennan's alleged mental incapacity, the board requires a second opinion from a specialist in nervous disorders. Dr. Hayes held up an official-looking document. "This is perfectly routine in cases involving competency rulings." Behind Thomas, Caleb could see movement in the hallway. Mrs. Dalton, the hired nurse, hovering nervously in the background. She caught sight of him through the window and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Maggie was awake and aware, fighting off the effects of whatever drugs they'd been giving her. "This is highly irregular," Thomas protested, but his voice lacked conviction. He was trapped between his desire to refuse and his need to maintain the facade of being a concerned husband. "Perhaps we could schedule this for later in the week." "I'm afraid the matter is urgent," Jim Crawford interrupted, stepping into view with his marshal's badge prominently displayed. "There's been a formal complaint filed regarding the circumstances of Mrs. Brennan's commitment. The territorial government takes these matters very seriously." Thomas's face went pale. "A complaint? From whom?" "That's not something I can discuss at this time," Crawford replied smoothly. "But I can tell you that until this matter is resolved, Mrs. Brennan is under the protection of this office." It was a masterful performance, combining official authority with just enough vagueness to keep Thomas off balance. Caleb watched from across the street as the man who'd terrorized Maggie for 3 years found himself backed into a corner by legal procedures he couldn't intimidate or buy his way out of. "Very well," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage, "but I insist on being present during any examination." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Dr. Hayes replied calmly. "Medical ethics require privacy between physician and patient. I'm sure you understand." The next 20 minutes felt like hours as they waited for Dr. Hayes to complete his examination. Caleb positioned himself where he could watch both the front and back of the house, while Crawford maintained his official presence on the front porch, and Patrick O'Brien lingered nearby with his freight wagon, ready to provide transportation if they needed to leave quickly. When Dr. Hayes finally emerged, his face was carved from granite. He spoke quietly to Crawford, then both men approached Thomas with the kind of formal gravity that left no room for argument. "Mr. Brennan," Dr. Hayes began, his voice carrying across the street, "I've completed my examination of your wife, and I'm afraid I have serious concerns about her current condition and treatment." "What kind of concerns?" "Mrs. Brennan shows clear signs of narcotic poisoning, consistent with prolonged administration of laudanum or similar substances. She's severely malnourished and exhibits physical injuries that are inconsistent with self-inflicted harm or accidental occurrence." Thomas's face flushed red. "Are you suggesting that I've somehow mistreated my wife? She's been under constant medical supervision." "I'm stating medical facts," Dr. Hayes interrupted. "Mrs. Brennan is lucid, coherent, and shows no signs of the mental incapacity described in Dr. Fleming's assessment. In my professional opinion, she's been deliberately sedated to maintain an appearance of incompetence." "That's absurd. Dr. Fleming has been treating nervous disorders for 20 years. Dr. Fleming has also failed to document any of the injuries I observed, nor has he questioned the presence of opiates in a patient supposedly suffering from mental confusion rather than physical pain." Dr. Hayes's voice cut like a scalpel. Either he's incompetent or he's complicit. It was at that moment that Maggie appeared in the doorway behind Thomas. She moved slowly, clearly still fighting the effects of whatever they'd been giving her, but her eyes were alert and focused. When she saw Caleb across the street, her face lit up with an expression of pure relief. "Caleb," she called out, her voice stronger than anyone expected. "You came for me." Thomas spun around, his mask of concerned husband finally slipping to reveal the rage beneath. "Get back inside, Margaret. You're not well." "I'm perfectly well," she said clearly, stepping out onto the porch. "And my name is Maggie, not Margaret. I've told you that for 3 years." The simple declaration, spoken in front of witnesses with official authority, changed everything. This wasn't a confused woman being cared for by a devoted husband. This was a prisoner finally able to speak for herself. "Mrs. Brennan," Jim Crawford said formally, "are you here of your own free will?" "No," Maggie replied, her voice carrying clearly across the street. "I am not." Thomas Brennan's composure shattered like glass striking stone. "She doesn't know what she's saying," he snarled, grabbing Maggie's arm with a grip that made her wince. "The head injury has left her confused, prone to wild fantasies. Let go of my wife." Caleb's voice cut through the morning air with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He stepped into the street, his movement deliberate and controlled, but there was something in his bearing that made Thomas instinctively step back. "Your wife?" Thomas's voice rose to near hysteria. "She's my wife, you mountain savage. Legally married for 3 years. Not anymore." Jim Crawford produced another document from his coat. "This is a formal annulment petition, filed this morning with the territorial court. Dr. Hayes's medical examination has provided evidence that the marriage was conducted under false pretenses and maintained through coercion." "You can't do this." Thomas's face had gone purple with rage. "I have connections. Influence. The governor himself has dined at my table. The governor has also received some interesting correspondence about your business practices," Patrick O'Brien said, joining the group with several other men who'd been waiting in his freight wagon. "Seems there are questions about those lumber contracts, about timber being harvested from federal land without proper permits." Thomas looked around wildly, finally realizing he was surrounded by men who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or reasoned with. His eyes fell on Sheriff Crenshaw, who'd been conspicuously absent from the morning's confrontation. "Where's William? He'll sort this out. He knows the truth about this situation." "Sheriff Crenshaw has been temporarily relieved of his duties, pending an investigation into his handling of this case," Crawford said calmly. "Seems there are questions about his failure to properly investigate allegations of domestic violence." The sound that came from Thomas's throat was barely human. For 3 years, he'd controlled every aspect of Maggie's life through fear and violence. For months, he'd hunted her with the certainty that money and connections would eventually bring her back under his power. Now, watching his carefully constructed web of influence collapse around him, he reverted to the only method of control he'd ever really trusted. "She belongs to me," he said, his voice dropping to something cold and deadly. "I don't care what papers you have or what lies she's told. She's my property, and I'm taking her home." He reached inside his coat, and Caleb saw the glint of metal that meant a hidden weapon. But 30 years of mountain living and military training had left him with reflexes that age hadn't dulled. He moved faster than a man his size should have been able to, closing the distance between them in 2 quick strides. The gun never cleared Thomas's coat. Caleb's hand clamped around his wrist with the strength of a man who'd spent decades swinging an axe and hauling traplines. Thomas cried out as his fingers went numb, and the weapon clattered to the porch. "You shouldn't have done that," Caleb said quietly. "Drawing a weapon in front of a federal marshal tends to complicate legal situations." "Federal marshal?" Thomas's eyes went wide with sudden understanding. "You're not just a territorial." "Deputy Federal Marshal James Crawford," Crawford confirmed, producing a different badge from his pocket. "And you, Mr. Brennan, are under arrest for attempted assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful imprisonment, and conspiracy to defraud federal officers." But Thomas wasn't finished. Desperation made him reckless, and he lunged toward Maggie with the wild fury of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. His hands reached for her throat, his face twisted with 3 years of accumulated rage at her defiance. He never reached her. Caleb's fist connected with Thomas's jaw, with the solid impact of a sledgehammer striking stone. The smaller man went down hard, his head bouncing off the porch boards with a sound that made several witnesses wince. "That," Caleb said, rubbing his knuckles, "was personal." Thomas tried to get up, blood streaming from his nose, his eyes wild with hatred. "This isn't over," he gasped. "I have friends, connections." "You had friends," Dr. Hayes corrected, kneeling to check his injuries with professional detachment. "Past tense. Word has a way of spreading about men who beat their wives. Your business associates may find themselves questioning previous dealings." Mrs. Henderson, who'd been watching from across the street with half the town's female population, stepped forward with the kind of righteous anger that only a woman who'd raised 6 children could muster. "Thomas Brennan," she said, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority, "you are a disgrace to decent men everywhere. I've got half a mind to let the women of this town deal with you ourselves." The murmur of agreement from the assembled crowd made it clear that Thomas had lost more than just his legal authority. He'd lost the respect and fear that had been the foundation of his power. As Crawford placed shackles on Thomas's wrists, Maggie moved slowly toward Caleb. She was still weak from her ordeal, still fighting the effects of the drugs they'd forced on her, but her eyes were clear and determined. "You came for me," she said simply. "I promised you this wasn't over," Caleb replied, opening his arms to receive her. "Some promises are worth keeping." When she stepped into his embrace, the watching crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Justice, it seemed, still had meaning in the Montana Territory. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning, when the aspen leaves had turned to gold and the mountain air carried the promise of winter's return, Maggie stood before the mirror in the cabin that had become her true home. The dress she wore was simple but beautiful, fashioned from fabric that had once been curtains, sewn with careful stitches and decorated with wildflowers she'd pressed between the pages of books during the summer months. It wasn't the elaborate gown she'd worn to her first wedding, with its layers of silk and expensive lace, but it was hers, made by her own hands for a ceremony that meant everything because it was freely chosen. "You look beautiful," Caleb said from the doorway, and she turned to see him dressed in his best shirt and trousers, his hair neatly combed and his face clean-shaven. At 60, he was still a handsome man. But more than that, he was a good man, the kind of man she'd never dared hope she might find. "Are you nervous?" she asked, smoothing the simple skirt of her dress. "Should I be?" Most men get nervous on their wedding day. Most men haven't spent half a year planning this particular wedding. He moved to her side, taking her hands in his larger, calloused ones. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Through the cabin window, they could see their guests beginning to gather in the small clearing where they'd decided to hold the ceremony. The whole town had come. It seemed Mrs. Henderson and her family, Reverend Mills with his worn Bible, Dr. Hayes, who'd made the journey from Denver specifically for this occasion. Even Jim Crawford was there, having taken leave from his federal duties to serve as best man. But it was the presence of the other women that meant the most to Maggie. Word of Thomas Brennan's arrest and trial had spread throughout the territory, and with it had come other stories, other women who'd found the courage to speak about their own experiences with violent husbands. Mrs. Peterson, whose clumsiness had explained too many broken bones. Sarah Mills, the Reverend's own daughter, whose first marriage had ended when she'd finally told her father the truth about why she flinched whenever her husband raised his voice. The trial itself had been swift once Dr. Hayes's evidence was presented alongside testimonies from other victims. Thomas had been sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, his business empire dismantled and sold to pay damages to his victims. The lumber mill now operated under new ownership, with policies that protected workers and fair wages that reflected honest labor. "Time to go," Caleb said, offering her his arm. They walked together from the cabin to the clearing, where folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows, and wildflowers decorated a simple arch that Patrick O'Brien had constructed for the occasion. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. Reverend Mills waited beneath the arch with his Bible open and a smile that spoke of genuine joy for two people who'd found each other against all odds. When Caleb and Maggie took their places before him, the assembled crowd grew quiet, with the kind of reverent attention reserved for moments that truly mattered. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other not just love, but the courage to build a life worth living." The ceremony was simple but profound. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises that spoke not of obedience and duty, but of partnership and respect, of standing together against whatever storms might come. When Caleb slipped the ring onto Maggie's finger, a simple gold band he'd commissioned from the town's blacksmith, she felt the weight of real commitment, freely given and gladly received. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana," Reverend Mills concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Caleb, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle and sweet, witnessed by a community that had rallied around them when justice was needed and now celebrated with them as love triumphed. When they broke apart, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers that echoed off the surrounding peaks. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables groaned under the weight of food, contributed by every family in attendance. Music filled the air as fiddles and harmonicas created melodies that had feet tapping and couples dancing beneath the stars. Children ran between the adults, their laughter adding to the joyful noise that marked a community coming together to celebrate something good. As the evening wound down and guests began to make their way back to town, Maggie found herself standing with Caleb at the edge of the clearing, looking out over the valley that had become their sanctuary. "Any regrets?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Only one," she said, leaning into his warmth. "What's that?" "That it took me so long to find you." She looked up at him, her face serious in the moonlight. "All those years I spent thinking I had to settle for whatever life offered, never believing I deserved better." "You deserved everything," he said simply. "You deserved love and respect and the freedom to choose your own path. You deserved a partner, not a master. We both deserved better than what we had. But maybe we needed those years of loneliness to appreciate what we've found now." A year later, their story had become something of a legend throughout the territory, the tale of the mountain man who'd rescued a bride from the snow and the woman who'd had the courage to claim her freedom. But for Caleb and Maggie, it wasn't a story at all. It was simply life, the quiet, daily joy of two people who'd learned that real love wasn't about possession or control, but about choosing each day to build something beautiful together. Sometimes, on winter evenings, when the snow fell thick outside their windows, Maggie would look up from her book to find Caleb watching her with the same wonder in his eyes that had been there the day he'd carried her home from the drifts. And she would remember the bargain she'd made that desperate night, if you can carry me home, I'll be your wife, and marvel at how a promise born from desperation had become the foundation of the truest happiness she'd ever known. Home, she'd learned, wasn't a place. It was a person who chose to love you, not despite your scars, but because those scars were part of the story that had brought you to them. And in that truth, two wounded souls had found the healing they'd never dared hope for.